It was a sunny afternoon in the city, and the streets were buzzing with activity. Karen, who had been in a particularly bad mood all day, was walking down the busy sidewalk. She had just finished a long meeting and felt completely drained, irritated by the noise of the traffic and the crowds around her. As she made her way down the street, her eyes caught sight of a group of royal guards standing in front of the Grand Palace gates. They were tall, dressed in their traditional armor, and were known to be both strong and serious. For Karen, it wasn't the first time she had seen the guards. In fact, she had always found them a bit intimidating. But today, something about the guards irritated her more than usual. Maybe it was the way they stood so stiff and unmoving, or how they seemed to look down on everyone who passed by. Whatever it was, Karen was having a hard time dealing with it. Her frustration had been building all day, and she just couldn't shake it off. As she walked closer, a slight irritation bubbled up inside her. She had seen a group of tourists trying to take photos near the gates, but the guards wouldn't allow it, saying they couldn't be that close to the royal grounds. Karen overheard them, telling one of the tourists to move back, and she couldn't help but feel a wave of anger wash over her. Who do they think they are, ordering people around like that? She muttered to herself. At that moment, Karen made a decision. She was tired of being polite, tired of letting people walk all over her. The guards weren't just standing there doing their job. They were making everyone feel like they didn't belong. She marched right up to one of them, her heart pounding in her chest. You can't just stop people from taking pictures. What's the harm in it? She snapped, standing in front of the guard with her arms crossed. The guard, who had been standing tall and calm, turned to look at her. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at her, his face unreadable. But Karen was too worked up to notice. You're just standing there, looking all serious, like you own the place, she went on. Maybe if you spent less time with that look on your face and more time actually helping people, they'd appreciate you more. The words had barely left her mouth when she did something she instantly regretted. She reached into her bag and pulled out her pepper spray. Without thinking twice, she aimed it at the guard and sprayed it directly in his face. The stream of pepper spray hit him hard, and Karen could hear him gasp in surprise, stumbling backward. As soon as the spray hit, Karen froze. For a split second, she didn't know what to do. The guard's eyes started to water, and he struggled to keep his composure, clearly affected by the spray. Karen's heart raced, and she felt a cold wave of panic rush over her. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She had just pepper sprayed a royal guard. This wasn't just some random person. This was someone with power, someone who could easily cause her a world of trouble. The shock of what she had just done was enough to make her breathless. The guard stood there, eyes squinting and face twisted in pain, but he didn't say anything at first. Karen felt her stomach drop. What had she done? The crowd around them had gone silent, watching the scene unfold, and Karen could feel all eyes on her. The weight of the moment hit her hard. What would happen now? The moment the pepper spray hit the guard, a strange, tense silence filled the air. Karen watched in disbelief as the guard staggered back, his eyes squinting, his face twisted in pain. The spray had caught him off guard, and she could tell it was affecting him more than she expected. His hand shot up to his face, trying to wipe the stinging sensation away, but it was clear that the spray was taking its toll. His usually calm and composed demeanor was now replaced with a look of distress, and Karen immediately felt a pang of regret. Her heart started pounding in her chest. She had acted without thinking, and now she couldn't take it back. For a brief moment, she stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The guard took a deep breath, his face still scrunched in pain, but he didn't shout or make a scene. Instead, he reached for his communication device attached to his uniform and spoke in a low, controlled voice. Karen couldn't hear the exact words, but she could tell he was calling for backup. Her stomach dropped. She had just made a huge mistake. The realization hit her like a wave. She had just attacked someone who wasn't just any person. He was a royal guard, part of the elite team that protected the royal family. They weren't just any guards. They were the most highly trained and respected security personnel in the entire country. Karen had no idea what she was up against now. She thought briefly about running, but she knew it was too late. She was stuck, and her impulsive action had now set things in motion that she couldn't reverse. Around her, people began whispering, some muttering in shock, others simply staring. It was as if time had slowed down, and Karen could feel the eyes of the crowd burning into her. Some people were recording the incident on their phones, which only made her feel more exposed and trapped. She tried to take a step back, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. A few bystanders were already talking among themselves, sharing their opinions on what had just happened. Some looked surprised, others seemed disapproving. She couldn't tell if they were on her side, or if they thought she was out of line. The guard, still visibly affected by the spray, stood up straighter, though it was clear he was struggling to focus. His vision must have been blurry, and his breathing was heavier than usual. Yet his expression remained calm, though there was a hint of anger in his eyes. Karen tried to apologize, her voice trembling as she said, I didn't mean to. I was frustrated. But it was too late for words. The guard didn't respond. Instead, he raised his hand, signaling for two other royal guards to step forward. Within moments, the additional guards arrived, their movements sharp and efficient. Karen could see the professionalism in their demeanor, their eyes scanning the area as they took positions around her. The situation was quickly escalating, and Karen's anxiety skyrocketed. She had no idea how this was going to end. She felt cornered, her thoughts racing as she tried to think of an explanation. But there was nothing that could undo the moment she had just created. One of the new guards stepped forward and looked at Karen. He said something to the first guard in a low voice. Karen couldn't make out the words, but it was clear that the guards were now coordinating their response. The atmosphere around them felt thick, almost suffocating. The crowd had begun to back away, sensing that things were about to get serious. Karen's heart was in her throat as she realized that she had just made an enemy out of someone who held far more power than she ever anticipated. Karen's mind was spinning as the guards closed in around her. She could feel her palms sweating and her heart racing as she tried to gather her thoughts. The pain in the first guard's eyes was still fresh in her mind, and now the others were looking at her with cold, hard eyes, their expressions unreadable. It was as if they were sizing her up, and Karen felt herself shrinking under their gaze. She knew she was in trouble, deep trouble, and she had no idea how to talk her way out of it. The guard who had been sprayed with pepper spray took a few more shaky breaths, his vision still clearly blurry. His face was red, eyes watering, but he remained composed, doing his best to stay on his feet. He didn't say anything, but Karen could tell he was struggling. Still, there was a quiet authority about him. His silence made the situation feel even more intense. The other guards didn't move, but their presence was enough to make Karen feel trapped, like she was surrounded by stone walls. One of the newer guards, taller and more imposing, stepped forward and took a moment to look at Karen. His eyes weren't angry, but they were stern and focused. He didn't waste time with words, just stood there silently, his arms crossed, as if waiting for something. Karen's stomach turned with anxiety. The realization that she had just made a terrible mistake hit her again, like a slap in the face. She had never imagined that a simple act of frustration would spiral into something so serious. She tried to open her mouth, but her voice felt small and useless. "I didn't mean to," Karen stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt empty, as if she was only saying them because she didn't know what else to say. She felt the pressure of the guard's gaze all around her. The lead guard, still visibly shaken but composed, took a step forward and spoke in a low, controlled voice. "Stay where you are," he said, his tone firm and steady. "We're calling for backup." The words struck Karen hard. Backup? Was this really that serious? She had thought maybe they'd just let it slide or give her a warning. But backup meant something much bigger. Her stomach knotted at the thought of police arriving, maybe even royal authorities. She realized just how far out of her depth she was. This wasn't just a little inconvenience anymore. This was quickly turning into a real crisis. The tall guard glanced over at the first guard, who had now regained some composure, though still clearly struggling with the effects of the pepper spray. The first guard nodded, signaling that he was okay, but it was clear the incident wasn't something they were willing to ignore. The lead guard pulled out his communication device and spoke into it, calmly but firmly. Karen stood there, feeling small and helpless. She didn't know what to do or say to make things right. In that moment, she realized how quickly things could spiral out of control when you let your emotions get the best of you. Her thoughts raced as she replayed the events in her mind. The frustration that had built up over the day, her irritation with the guards, her impulsive decision to act on it. Everything had led to this. She had sprayed a royal guard, a man who wasn't just any security officer, but someone connected to the royal family. And now, she was facing the consequences. A few minutes passed, but they felt like an eternity to Karen. The tension in the air was palpable. The guards stood firm and unyielding, as if they were waiting for something or someone. The crowd had started to gather again, whispering among themselves, but there was no comfort to be found in their voices. Everyone seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. The lead guard turned back toward Karen, his face still serious, but his tone softened slightly. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked. Karen opened her mouth to reply, but no words came out. How could she explain herself? She wasn't sure there were any words that could make this situation better. The weight of her actions hung over her like a dark cloud. All she could do was stand there and wait, unsure of what would happen next. Karen stood there, rooted to the spot, as the reality of her actions hit her harder than ever. She could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on her, and the silence around her seemed deafening. The royal guards, still standing in their formation, were now much more than just security personnel. They were like statues, watching her every move with an intensity that made her stomach churn. She wanted to explain herself, to make them understand that she didn't mean for things to get out of hand, but the words wouldn't come. She kept her eyes on the ground, trying to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. The whispers from the crowd around her were like background noise, distant and faint, but they only added to her feeling of exposure. She had never felt so vulnerable in her life. Her mind raced, but there was nothing she could think of that could make things right. She had sprayed a royal guard, and now she was at the mercy of the people she had just offended. The first guard, still struggling to recover from the effects of the pepper spray, was no longer holding his position. He had been a little slower to react, clearly still shaken, but now he stood more firmly, his eyes focused on Karen. There was no anger in his gaze, just an unspoken understanding that she had made a serious mistake. He didn't seem eager to press charges, but Karen knew that the damage had already been done. The lead guard, standing to the side, continued to observe her with that same, unwavering expression. He hadn't said much since the incident, but the look in his eyes told Karen everything she needed to know. His silence was a warning. He wasn't letting her off easily. His voice, when it finally came, was calm but carried a certain weight. "We need to make sure this doesn't escalate," he said, his tone clear. "You've caused a disruption, and we can't ignore that." Karen nodded, her throat dry. She wanted to speak, but she was afraid of making things worse. She opened her mouth to apologize once again, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she possibly say that would make a difference now? She was fully aware of the situation's gravity. She had lashed out in frustration, but now she was faced with the possibility of serious consequences far beyond her understanding. The other guards had started talking quietly among themselves. Karen couldn't hear their exact words, but she could sense the tension in their conversation. The way they moved and the way they exchanged glances told her that they weren't just talking about a simple mistake. No, this was a matter of protocol, of discipline, and of authority. The crowd, which had been murmuring ever since the incident, was starting to get restless. People were whispering about the severity of the situation, some judging Karen, others just trying to make sense of what had happened. Karen's skin felt hot, her face flushed with embarrassment. She wanted to disappear. How could she have been so careless, so quick to act without thinking of the consequences? As the police sirens grew louder in the distance, Karen's heart skipped a beat. They were coming. The gravity of what was happening sank deeper into her chest. The lead guard turned his attention back to her, and for the first time since this whole incident began, Karen saw a flicker of something softer in his eyes. It wasn't sympathy, but there was a hint of recognition, maybe even a slight understanding that she wasn't a criminal, just someone who had made a huge mistake. But that didn't change the fact that she was in serious trouble. The tension in the air was thick, and Karen couldn't escape it. She had acted on impulse, and now she was left to face the consequences. As the sound of the police grew nearer, Karen knew that her day was far from over, and whether she liked it or not, she would have to deal with whatever came next. The sound of sirens grew louder and louder, growing closer with each passing second. Karen's heart pounded in her chest, and her palms were now slick with sweat. The moment she had dreaded was finally here. The police were coming, and the weight of what she had done was about to catch up to her. She had always heard stories of people getting in trouble, but now she was the one in that position. It felt unreal. The guards remained in their positions, still and silent. The lead guard was on the communication device, speaking in low tones with someone on the other end. Karen couldn't hear the conversation, but the look on the guard's face told her everything. This wasn't just about an argument or a simple misunderstanding. This was far more serious. The fact that they had already called the police meant this wasn't going to be easily resolved. Karen shifted nervously on her feet, wishing she could just disappear. She had never felt so exposed. She wanted to explain, to beg them to understand that it was a moment of frustration, that she hadn't meant to cause any harm. But it was too late for apologies. What she had done was already done, and there was no way to undo it. She could feel the eyes of the crowd still on her, judging her silently as they watched the events unfold. Some looked sympathetic, others disapproving, but Karen couldn't bring herself to care about anything except the growing tension around her. The sirens finally stopped, and a police car pulled up to the scene. 2 officers got out, their uniforms sharp and professional. They didn't waste any time. One walked straight toward the lead guard, while the other approached Karen. The first officer, a tall man with a stern expression, gave Karen a quick look before focusing on the guard. The officer's eyes flickered with recognition when he saw the royal uniform. Karen felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She had no idea how the police were going to handle this, but she was sure it wasn't going to be good. The officer who had approached Karen gave her a firm but calm look. "Step aside," he said, motioning for her to move out of the way from the scene. Karen did as she was told, her mind racing. She wanted to explain, but she didn't know if it would make any difference now. She could feel her heart beating so fast that it almost hurt. Her legs felt weak, and she could barely hold herself steady. The officer didn't seem to be in any hurry to arrest her, but he wasn't giving her a break either. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice level, yet filled with authority. Karen swallowed hard, trying to gather her thoughts. I sprayed him," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to. I was frustrated. I just lost control for a second." The officer nodded, his expression unreadable. He didn't seem sympathetic, but he didn't seem angry either. He glanced at the lead guard, who gave a brief nod, indicating that the situation was under control for now. The officer turned back to Karen. "Do you understand the severity of your actions?" Karen's stomach turned. She nodded quickly. "Yes, I do. I understand. I didn't mean for it to escalate like this." Her voice cracked slightly, but she tried to steady herself. I didn't think." The officer didn't say anything for a moment. He simply looked at her, studying her reaction. She felt like she was under a microscope, every word she said being weighed carefully. The silence between them stretched on, and Karen felt like she was suffocating in the tension. She had never felt so helpless, so completely out of control of the situation. After a long pause, the officer nodded again. "Stay where you are. We'll be talking to you soon." Karen didn't dare argue. She simply stood there, her thoughts spiraling. She could only hope that things wouldn't get worse. The police had arrived, and she was now part of something far beyond her control. She had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was certain. This would be a day she would never forget. Karen stood still, her hands shaking as she tried to collect her thoughts. The officer had just walked away to speak with the lead guard, and she was left alone with her swirling anxiety. The sound of the crowd's whispers continued, but it felt like a distant hum compared to the thundering beats of her own heart. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own making. She never thought something so small, a single moment of frustration, could lead to such a chaotic situation. As she stood there, she replayed everything in her mind. How she had approached the guard, how angry she had been, and how quickly she had resorted to pepper spray. It was supposed to be a harmless action, a quick way to get her point across, but now she realized just how dangerous and reckless it had been. She hadn't considered the consequences, hadn't thought about the guard's well-being, or the severity of what she was doing. The more she thought about it, the worse she felt. Karen could hear the police officer speaking with the royal guard in the background. She strained to catch the words, but they were too far away. She felt a sinking feeling in her stomach, as if she were falling deeper and deeper into trouble with each passing minute. What would they do with her now? Would they arrest her? Would she face charges? She tried to think of a way out of this, but nothing came to mind. Her entire body felt heavy with regret and fear. After what seemed like an eternity, the officer returned to her. His expression was neutral, but there was something about the way he looked at her that made Karen's chest tighten. She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat felt dry, and the words wouldn't come. She wanted to apologize again, to beg him to understand that it had all been a mistake, but the officer didn't give her a chance. "We're not going to arrest you today," he said calmly, but his words only made Karen feel more anxious. "But you need to understand the gravity of what you've done. Pepper spraying a royal guard is no small matter." Karen nodded quickly, the relief in her chest palpable, but it didn't completely ease her nerves. She had just dodged a bullet, but it felt like it was only temporary. The officer continued, "You'll be required to appear in court. There will be an investigation into this incident. The Royal Guard isn't just any security detail. You've disrupted a high-security operation." Karen's mind raced. Court. An investigation. She never imagined things would get this far. She had always thought that something like this would be a simple misunderstanding, something that could be resolved with an apology. But now the consequences seemed much more serious than she could have ever predicted. "I understand," Karen said quietly, feeling the weight of the officer's words sink in. She wanted to explain that she didn't mean to cause harm, but now she realized that the words were meaningless. Her actions spoke louder than anything she could say. The officer took a step back, signaling to the lead guard. "You'll be receiving a summons in the coming days," he added before turning toward the guards. The lead guard nodded and gave Karen one final look before he began to walk away with the other guards in tow. Karen stood there for a few moments, still trying to process everything. The reality of what had happened was starting to sink in. She wasn't off the hook. The worst of it was still to come, and she was left with the knowledge that her impulsive decision had set everything in motion. As the police car drove away, Karen realized that the consequences of her actions were only just beginning, and she couldn't escape what was coming next. As the police car disappeared down the street, Karen stood there, staring at the empty space where it had been just moments ago. Her mind was still reeling from everything that had happened, and she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The reality of the situation was settling in, and with it came a crushing weight of regret. She had no idea what would come next, but one thing was clear: this was far from over. The guards had already moved on, their duty complete for now, and a crowd had slowly begun to disperse, though a few still lingered nearby, perhaps waiting for more drama to unfold. Karen felt like a small, insignificant figure in the midst of it all. She had acted on impulse, not thinking about the consequences, and now she was left to deal with the aftermath. As she began to walk away, she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was still watching her, judging her. She kept her head down, trying to avoid eye contact with anyone who might be lingering in the crowd. Her thoughts kept swirling around over and over as she replayed the events in her head. How had it escalated so quickly? She hadn't meant for it to get out of control. In that moment, all she had wanted was to vent her frustration, to make a point, but now she understood that her actions had been reckless. She had crossed a line. Karen's phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out, hoping for some distraction, but it was just a message from a friend asking how her day had gone. She couldn't bring herself to respond. How could she explain to someone that she had just pepper-sprayed a royal guard? How could she even begin to tell them what had happened? She knew they wouldn't understand, and even if they did, it wouldn't make the situation any less serious. Her thoughts shifted to the court hearing the officer had mentioned. The idea of going to court made her stomach twist in knots. She wasn't used to being in trouble, let alone facing legal consequences. She had always been careful, always tried to follow the rules. But now, everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. She had no idea what to expect from the legal system or what kind of punishment she might face. Her actions were going to be judged, and she wasn't sure if she could handle that. Walking slowly, Karen made her way back to her apartment, each step heavy with the weight of the day's events. As she walked, she found herself wondering how she had gotten to this point. It seemed so silly, in hindsight, how a moment of frustration could lead to something so serious. But as much as she wanted to brush it off, she knew she couldn't. She had made a mistake, and now she had to face it. The streets were quieter now, the rush of the day slowly fading away as the evening set in. Karen's mind, however, was far from calm. She couldn't stop thinking about the royal guard, about how she had caused him pain, and how her impulsive decision had turned into something much bigger than she ever anticipated. She had no idea how the royal family would react or what kind of repercussions there would be. It was all a blur, a mess of emotions and consequences she couldn't undo. As she reached her apartment building, Karen paused for a moment, looking up at the tall structure. The world outside felt distant and strange, as if she were living in someone else's reality. Her day had started like any other, but now it had become something entirely different, something that would stay with her long after the police had left and the crowd had gone. She was left alone with her regret, with the knowledge that she would have to carry the weight of this mistake for a long time. The next few days passed in a blur. Karen barely remembered what had happened, but she couldn't shake the weight of the events. Every time she looked at her phone, there was a message from someone asking how she was doing, but she couldn't bring herself to tell anyone the full story. It felt too big, too overwhelming to explain in just a few sentences. She felt embarrassed, humiliated, and unsure of how to face anyone after what she had done. One morning, she woke up to an unexpected letter. It was official looking, with a seal she didn't recognize. Her hands trembled as she opened it, half dreading what it might say. As she read through the letter, her heart sank. It was a formal summons. The royal family had decided to press charges, and she was now required to appear in court. The reality of what had happened truly hit her. It wasn't just an embarrassing mistake anymore. It was something that was going to affect her life for a long time. Karen felt her chest tighten with anxiety. She had never been in a courtroom, never imagined she would be in a situation like this. She had always prided herself on following the rules, doing things by the book. But now, here she was, facing the consequences of one impulsive action. She wished she could turn back time, wished that she could take back that moment of frustration, but she knew that wasn't possible. All she could do now was face what was coming. The days leading up to her court appearance felt endless. Karen tried to distract herself with her usual routine, but nothing seemed to take her mind off the situation. Every conversation, every task she did, felt distant and unimportant compared to the looming trial. Her friends and family kept asking how she was holding up, but she just smiled and told them everything would be fine, even though she had no idea if that was true. It was hard to lie to them, but she didn't want anyone to see how terrified she truly felt. When the day of the court hearing finally arrived, Karen dressed carefully, her nerves making her hands shake as she buttoned up her coat. She had never been so afraid of something in her life. She took the subway to the courthouse, trying to calm her racing thoughts, but every stop seemed to make her feel more anxious. She arrived early, standing outside the imposing building, unsure of what to expect. As she walked into the courtroom, she felt small and insignificant. The room was filled with people, some in suits, others in uniforms, but everyone seemed more important than she was. She took a seat in the waiting area, feeling like an outsider in a world she didn't belong to. The guards, she realized, were also there. They sat across the room, their expressions unreadable, and for a moment, she wondered if they were looking at her with judgment. She quickly turned away, not wanting to meet their eyes. The judge's gavel struck, and the room fell silent. Karen was called to stand. Her heart raced as she walked to the front, trying to keep her knees from shaking. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she was about to find out. The royal guard who had been sprayed with pepper spray was sitting at the front, his face calm, but there was a sternness in his eyes. She could tell he wasn't happy, but there was no sign of anger, just an air of professionalism. The prosecutor began to speak, outlining what had happened, and Karen's heart sank lower with each word. She had done something wrong, something serious, and now she was being judged for it. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. She had practiced what she would say, but now, with all the eyes on her, the words seemed to escape her. Finally, she managed to get out, I'm truly sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I acted out of frustration, and I deeply regret what I did." Her voice trembled as she spoke, but she hoped the sincerity of her apology would be enough. The courtroom fell silent as everyone listened, and for the first time since the incident, Karen felt like she had finally said what needed to be said. The weight of her actions, the mistakes she had made, were all out in the open. Now, all she could do was wait and see what would happen next.